Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our weekly OEC and EPB seminar. It is my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Angela Chira. Dr. Chira is an evolutionary biologist that studies the evolution of diversification in both bird morphology and human culture. She got her undergraduate and master's degree in zoology at University of Sheffield, UK, with Dr. Ben Hatchwell, where she studied how animal personality influenced parental care of cooperatively breeding birds. She then went on to get her PhD in evolutionary biology, also at University of Sheffield, with Dr. Gavin Thomas, working on ecomorphological diversification in birds. So she's now currently a postdoc at Washington University, Department of Biology, in Dr. Carlos Botero's lab, working on association between cognition and diversification in birds, as well as how human culture practices spreads and change through time. So which I believe we'll hear more about today. So also an exciting news, Dr. Chira will soon be heading to a new postdoc position in evolutionary anthropology at Max Planck Institute to look at the expansion of people in the Pacifics and the diversification of their many languages. So some fun facts about her. Her favorite aspect of human culture is the evolution of narratives, so folklore, fairy tales, and mythologies. And she also wants to remind all of us that, here I quote, "Raven is the most sublime form of life, period." So with this, I will hand the mic over to Dr. Chira and take it away.
Thank you for the introduction, and huge thanks to the Living Earth Collaborative for the invitation to give a talk and for putting together this wonderful series of online seminars. So the work I'm going to talk about today is work done here at WashU with Carlos Botero in collaboration with Russell Gray from the Department of Linguistic and Cultural Evolution at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. And the work falls under the larger umbrella of projects in which we are trying to understand very broad questions about the spread and accumulation of cultural diversity in the last tens of thousands of years. And specifically, this project tackles an intriguing hypothesis proposed by Jared Diamond. He's currently a professor of geography at UCLA, but he's probably best known for his popular science books that are a blend of a wide range of topics, such as human evolution and history and economics, both of the past and present. And the focus of today's talk is Diamond's perhaps most popular book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, which addresses the contrasting histories of European and Asian peoples versus Native Americans, Africans, and Australian, and puts forward several predominantly biogeographic explanations for the history of peoples in different areas of the globe. And Diamond mainly compares the world's land masses on aspects such as the availability and suitability for domestication of flora and fauna, as well as the ease at which agriculture and animal husbandry, alongside other cultural practices, spread among the peoples. And he then speculates that such ecological biases in the birth and spread of cultural innovations may have contributed to differences, for example, in terms of the development of large stratified societies and various technological advances, as well as the exposure to various epidemic diseases, and ultimately to the differences in the trajectories of societies in different regions of our world. So it's essentially a book about big and distinguishable biogeographic and cultural patterns in our history. And the book was a hit. It was undoubtedly an exceptional success. It attracted lots of attention. It's recognized by awards such as the Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction. It sold millions of copies worldwide. Apparently, there's a documentary series produced by Nat Geo Society in 2005. And it is still today very much in the minds of both the public and scholars of history and anthropology and cultural evolution, as well as scholars of ecology and biogeography. And it's definitely an intriguing and controversial work. You can find opinions about it from being one of the most important works on the human past to a huge disservice to the telling of human history. And I'll talk about criticism a bit later, But I would like to move the discussion towards the focus of today's talk, which is the axis of orientation hypothesis put forward in chapter 10, which is called Spacious Skies and Tilted Axes. So Diamond starts this chapter with the observation that the Americas span a much greater distance north-south than east-west. That is, the major axis of the Americas is north-south. And the same is true about Africa, whereas in Eurasia, the major continental axis is west-east. And for the rest of the chapter, Diamond seeks to understand what effect, if any, did those differences in the orientation of the continent's axis have on human history. And the thesis follows the logic that the available land in the vertically oriented land masses is spread across a variety of latitudes, whereas in Eurasia, vast amounts of land are spread across regions with similar latitudes, meaning that many regions could exhibit similar ecologies. So for example, similar day length and seasonal variations, and to a lesser degree, but still, similar regimes of temperature and humidity, similar types of vegetations, of habitat makeup, etc. Essentially, similarities that could associate with the requirements of flora and fauna used in various aspects of daily life, and the best example being crops and livestock. And the argument goes that these similarities could have facilitated an easier diffusion of cultural innovation within latitudinal bands. So for example, Eurasia's west-east axis potentially helped fertile crescent crops to rapidly launch agriculture over a band of temperate latitudes across Europe and also east towards the Indus Valley. And if we go back to the scheme that lists ultimate and proximate potential factors for the contrasting histories of the world's land masses, here we have the east-west axis of Eurasia and the ease of species spreading, cascading into differences in the spread of other important innovations, and potentially contributing to the very different experiences of Native Americans, Africans, and Eurasians in the last 500 years, as Diamond puts it. So obviously there's a lot to unpack here regarding the assumptions and the proposed links between factors in terms of supportive evidence, but as well as conceptually. So first, the very basic observation of a north-south versus east-west major axis for the world's land masses can be misleading when looking at the map represented as a flat piece of paper. But more than that, the hypothesis has been criticized for numerous other reasons. So for example, this idea that certain plant species can only be used by peoples living in the right environment, it makes sense, but it ignores the fact that humans modify much of the environment in which they use their wild plants and animals. And also a lot of crops tolerate quite a wide range of environments. And further, the selection of arguments is compelling, but it has been criticized for being rather subjective. So the best examples that are consistent with the hypotheses are put forward, but perhaps the counterexamples are being given less importance. I mean, there are places in Eurasia within latitudinal bands that are very different in their environments. A lot of the land in Eurasia is inhospitable, etc. So as with a lot of these big biogeographic explanations, Diamond hypothesis puts forward a one-size-fits-all approach. And further, broader criticism concerns the whole fundament of these ideas, and the whole Guns, Germs, and Steel is criticized for being Eurocentric and for falling under the spell of environmental determinism. Diamond says environment molds history, but cultural factors and historical contingency are clearly important, and they are downplayed in these kind of purely environmental hypotheses. And obviously, a lot of this criticism requires in-depth debates and discussion, and it's not easy to come to a conclusion about it. But some of it, I think, could be addressed by data-driven approaches and by quantitative, large-scale studies, which essentially go beyond selectively listing plausible narratives. So there are some previous works in that respect. Notably, Lightin et al. Showed a pattern of higher persistence of linguistic diversities in countries with a wider north-south axis. So culture appears to more likely diffuse and homogenize on an east-west than a north-south axis. And also Gulderman and Hammerstrom also argue for the latitudinal, for a latitude spread potential of linguistic groups. And Turchin et al. Showed that there is predominantly a east-west orientation of both historical and modern states. So all these findings are consistent with Diamond's hypotheses. So we also put forward a quantitative test for the hypotheses, but we focus on the very core assumptions and predictions, not so much in terms of expected consequences, such as the comparison in terms of the history of peoples around the globe. So we first test for ecological biases in the spread of cultural traits by asking whether environmental factors are indeed linked with the ease at which cultural traits spread. And secondly, if environmental barriers to cultural spread exist, are there indeed continental scale differences in the strength of such barriers? And can we find evidence that the barriers are smaller in the landmass of Eurasia with its wide latitudinal bands compared to the so-called vertically orientated Americas and Africa? And so to put this into perspective, we are dealing with this top corner here out of the whole guns, germs, and steel thesis. So for our first question, we first need to quantify the ease at which traits spread. Then we need to quantify environmental barriers. And thirdly, we need to model the association between the two. And we will do this by using a cross-cultural approach. So we will ask about the spread of key cultural traits between pairs of cultural groups or societies around the world, and then link cultural similarity with similarities in the environment the people living in the societies are experiencing. And in most cases, when I say society here, is basically a group of people at a focal location with a shared language that differs from that of their neighbors. So to give a less abstract representation, for example, let's look at the dominant subsistence economy of societies. So we take a society here. This society relies predominantly on pastoralism as a subsistence mode. And other societies around it can also rely on pastoralism or use other means of subsistence, such as fishing or agriculture or gathering. So essentially, we can simply code pairs of societies as sharing or not sharing the same subsistence mode. And in practice, we choose the societies we are asking about based on focal society and its closest 100 cultural groups. And we prune these 100 numbers to the societies for which we actually have information on subsistence. So there's less than 100 points here. And the spatial scale thus looks more like this rather than comparing pairs all across Africa. So instead of quantifying the ease or the rate of cultural spread per se, we looked at whether societies share key practices, such as subsistence mode, in order to ask about the possible influence of environmental differences on cultural similarity. And we do this for 1,094 continental societies. These are the aquamarine color on the slide, for which a mountain of data on their key cultural practices exists in databases such as dplace. And if you have some time and you're interested, I would really encourage you to check the website out because it's very user-friendly, it's very interactive. You'll find maps and information on tons of traits and societies, and all these data are open access. And I've plotted other examples here. So each dot is a society with known data. And here we have our map for the dominant mode of subsistence, and it's not surprisingly is dominated by agriculture. Those are the red dots. This map here is showing inheritance rules for land. So for example, if the property is inherited by sons or heirs or sister sons in a matrilinear or patrilinear system. This map here shows descent, a major type of descent, which is dominated in dark green by patrilineal descent. And this map here shows the types of class differentiation. And they go from, for example, green, dark green, which is the absence of class, to red, which is the complex stratification. But there are many traits that are related to all sorts of aspects, such as housing ecology. So for example, what is the material people build the walls of their houses from? Practices related to marriage, so residence of pair after marriage, or transaction of wealth at marriage. We have traits related to ritual, so the range of beliefs, or ritual customs, such as male genital mutilations. And we have traits related to labor, so for example, specialization by sex in various professions. And in total, for this project, we quantified patterns of cultural similarity for 67 out of these key cultural practices. And that's the data we use to estimate the spread of cultural traits. And we then moved to quantify our environmental predictors potentially linked with cultural similarity between pairs of society. And in general, Diamond talks about environmental barriers as essentially being differences in the environmental conditions from the location where the cultural innovation took off. So the argument goes that, for example, the use of a wild plant for various purposes by society A is more likely to spread to society B if the environments of these two societies share similar ecologies, but also if the intervening space between them shows environmental homogeneity, in the idea that a cultural practice is easier to be successfully implemented and transmitted along the way if the environment is homogeneous, compared to diffusing through a wide range of very distinct ecologies. And we choose to focus on two environmental axes. So they are related to temperature and precipitation because of their relevance, the obvious links being practices related to flora and fauna or housing materials, for example, but they also relate to other things like rituals, and also because of the availability of the data. And the temperature axis incorporates information about the annual mean, variability, and predictability of temperature. And it essentially categorizes areas of the globe on a continuum from the harsh, which are the cold, the unpredictable and variable environments, to the warm, predictable, and invariable in terms of temperature. And we apply the same algorithm for precipitation to obtain an index that describes the harsh or arid regions with a low, variable, and unpredictable precipitation regime to the humid, predictable, and invariable ones. And armed with these two maps, we estimated the two types of environmental predictors. So first, how different environmental conditions are at the locations of societies in pairs, because remember, we are trying to predict the odds of pairs sharing a certain cultural trait. And this is straightforward. This is the aridity index map. We just take the absolute difference between these two locations. And secondly, we think about how difficult it is for a cultural trait to spread outside the location of a particular society. And for that, we focus on a different kind of map, which tells us how different the environment is in all these cells compared to here, the location of the focal society. So how difficult it was for practices to spread and be successfully implemented in the regions outside the focal society. So we want to somehow quantify this space between the localities of societies in pairs based on how different it is from the start location. And to do this, we could take this map of differences from the origin, which is in this case here, and just quantify the cost along the straight line, for example. Well, of course, we don't know the route these cultural traits took, and in fact, they probably did not take the straight line path. I'm sorry for the rather nerdy analogy, but I was very excited when I thought of it. I think many of us know that in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, they also didn't just fly the ring to Mordor on the back of eagles, regardless of how much some people would like to argue that could have been a possibility. Rather, the characters took a much more complicated path, which was dictated by the challenges across the terrain between the start in the Shire and the destination of Mount Doom. We also computed such a route using least cost paths algorithms that find a path between two societies on which the environment is most similar to the origin. So the path of least environmental resistance. And we take the accumulated cost, basically the sum of the values of these differences from origin, and also the length of the path as estimates of environmental barriers in terms of this intervening space between societies in pairs. And we do this for A, society A, and then for B, and then average, because for this part of the analysis, we don't know the direction of cultural spread. We only have the end result, if they're similar or not. And we compute 3 estimates for these types of barriers. So in terms of aridity, this is panel C, which was the example. In terms of temperature conditions, and note that these 2 maps can be different. So here it shows, this map shows temperature differences in temperature conditions from the star location, and this is the path of least resistance in terms of temperature. And panel A shows how we compute these barriers also in terms of elevation, because elevation and altitude associate with plant and animal ecologies in general, and with other sorts of cultural practices, but also because topographic costs are a very good representation of travel costs between societies, because culture is also spread by people traveling and spreading the word about their practices. Okay, so I can finally spell out the model here. So here we have the odds of sharing key cultural traits, and we correlate this with environmental predictors in terms of the intervening space between societies, with barriers in terms of dissimilarity at the locations of the two societies. And we do this separate for temperature and aridity. I only put 1 map here, but both of the predictors are in. And we also include the straight line length. So the geodesic distance is just a good measure of how far societies are in general. And in this model, we also have 2 covariates. So first, we need to account for Galton's problem of vertical transmission, essentially to account for the non-independence of societies who share commonalities by descent. And we estimate this non-independence based on the phylogenetic relationship between their languages. So we add phylogenetic distance between pairs in the model. And we use a phylogeny of languages because languages are a good representation of the history of expansions and splits in cultural groups in general. And they are thus a good, a reasonable estimate for the history of these populations. And also for the same reason, they fit a tree branching model very well. And we also account for cultural diffusion, and particularly for the fact that societies can get cultural traits from anywhere within their proximate cultural neighborhood. So for example, here, 3 out of 5 of the closest cultural groups to society A have the trait of B, which is in this case pastoralism. But the higher this number, the most likely it is that A could have borrowed pastoralism from any of its nearby neighbors and not from B. So we do this for both of these societies and we average to get essentially an estimate of the chance of cultural similarities in the pair via indirect exposure. So this is our final model. And we run this for 67 cultural traits. So there are 67 independent models. And before I go into the actual results, I want to point out that these models suffer from multicollinearity. So particularly environmental predictors can be correlated with each other. So what we do, we run the predictors in a PCA prior to the model, and then the PCs actually go as predictors in the model. So in the end, we quantify the grouped effect, if you want, of multiple of these factors here that load on the same PC. And in terms of what we expect, I have made a cartoon slide. And these plots are similar to the ones I'm actually going to show. So here, each dot will be a cultural trait, so a different model. And here is the estimated effect of the environmental barriers. And we expect that these coefficients in the models are negative. So the higher the environmental barrier between societies, so for example, differences or dissimilarities in their environments or more heterogeneous paths between them, the lower the chance of cultural similarity between them. That is what we expect according to the hypotheses. But conversely, if these coefficients are positive, it means that higher dissimilarity in environments actually associates with higher odds of cultural similarity. And these are the real results. So each panel has a combination of barriers that are grouped together by the PCA analysis prior to running these models. And I have here the models binned depending on the type of cultural trait they refer to. So for example, the traits in panel A are in order agriculture intensity, major crop type, domestic animal type, and a dominant subsistence mode. This is the example I used so far. And at a first glance, these plots look more like what we expect, as in a lot of these coefficients are negative, meaning, for example, here in panel B, higher differences in temperature conditions where societies are, and also high heterogeneity in temperature on the path that connects them is linked with a lower chance of cultural similarity. And panel C shows the same results, but for aridity. And panel A has a combination of topographic distances, and in general, barriers here mean longer path between societies and travel costs. We also have some odd ones out, including major crop type here. So that essentially, do societies share the major dominant crop type they use? So that's grouped as cereal or vegetables or fruit or root. Essentially, this graph is saying that more dissimilarity in temperature regimes and high temperature turnover means that it's more likely for societies to share major crop type. And I'm not an expert on ancient crops by any means, and I know we have quite a few in our department and hopefully among us. So please do let me know if this is this something I'm expecting in terms of the environment? Does this make actual sense? Or conversely, these might just be, this one and the other odd ones out might be examples where cultural factors and not environmental ones are the more important in the spread of practices. So I know there's a lot of richness in these results, and I'm kind of glancing over them, but the purpose of this analysis was the general pattern. And I think I can add a celebratory tick mark on this slide and say that the results support the idea that societies that occupy similar environments and are also connected by environmentally homogeneous paths are indeed more likely to share key cultural traits. So this gets us to the second part of this analysis. So far, our results support the idea that geo-environmental barriers can affect the rates of cultural spread. But now we need to test whether there are continental differences in the strength of such barriers, and if these differences follow Diamond's proposal. So if we were to quantify these barriers between the localities of societies across the globe, would we see that these kind of barriers are smaller in Eurasia with its east-west axis compared to other areas of the world? Because that was the whole overarching idea of the hypothesis. And we do this by looking at a test case. So we looked at environmental barriers for the spread of culture outside 16 areas of the globe. And these areas are recognized as centers of independent plant and animal domestication, because this was the main example used by Diamond to kind of support his hypotheses. So here we have areas such as the Fertile Crescent, the regions in China, India, 4 regions in Africa, 3 in South America, Mesoamerica, and East-North America. And what we do was we take these areas, we look at the societies that reside there. Those are the dots in black on this slide. And then for each of these societies, we build 2 networks, a close range, which is in dark green, which means the closest 100 neighbors. But we also build a long range network of neighbors, which are the closest 100 cultural groups that reside further away than 2,500 kilometers. And I don't know how much that is in miles, but these are the kind of scales that are represented here. So the idea was to quantify environmental barriers that we mentioned in part 1 for each society and its close and then its long-range networks of neighbors. And I want to reiterate this idea here that this part of the analysis is strictly environmental. It's not conditioned on cultural data. So these networks are built using coordinates from a data set of 8,000 or so cultural groups. And the whole idea is to quantify barriers between locations of societies and then compare these across different areas of the globe. So we compute these environmental barriers that I already mentioned. So in terms of the intervening path between societies in pairs, barriers at the location of societies, the length of the geodesic path, and we also add another barrier for the close range networks. And that is this idea of the size of the ecologically similar cultural neighborhood. Essentially, for each society, we build this uninterrupted polygon of very similar environmental conditions in terms of temperature and separately in terms of aridity. And then we ask how many societies reside within this area. So essentially, we consider as an environmental barrier having a very tiny area of a very similar environment around you, and also very few other societies in that area, because it means less people around it find a focal innovative trait beneficial. So in the idea that cultural innovations may diffuse more easily when more people find them beneficial. Okay, so we compute these environmental barriers, and as in part 1, all these first go into a PCA. So each environmental essential barrier that we compare actually has information on multiple of these environmental factors that are correlated with each other. And then we compare the means of those barriers among the 16 areas of the globe. And these are some cartoon graphs again of how the results would, what are our expectations. So here each dot is the mean, and then the lines would be standard deviation of environmental barriers. And they are color-coded by continent. And what we expect to see, if the hypothesis is to be supported, is smaller barriers in the Eurasian areas. These are the kind of brown colors compared to the rest of the areas. So we don't have a prediction of how these are supposed to rank, but the idea is that Eurasian areas should consistently show smaller barriers than the rest of the world. And conversely, if we see no significant differences between all these areas, or if they just all rank randomly, these results would not indicate support for the idea that the horizontally orientated Eurasia presents smaller environmental barriers to cultural spread. And here are the actual results. So the PCA grouped some of these barriers together. So each panel has a combination of barriers. And these are the results for the barriers at the close range. So within those kind of a small scale networks of neighbors. And the societies here are ordered from, the areas are ordered from the smaller barriers going up to higher barriers. And these inset matrices are just the two key pairwise comparisons. And as with part 1, there's a lot of richness and a lot to unpack. But I just wanted to highlight kind of 3 important messages that I take from these results. So the first one is that we don't see consistently smaller environmental barriers in Eurasian close range cultural networks. So we don't see the brown spots, like always, stacking up first here. Secondly, there is not really homogeneity within continents. So different areas of the same landmass can score differently in terms of environmental barriers. So here we can see that in terms of Eurasia, these are kind of 3 peaks or 3 different groupings of these barriers. So the distribution within landmasses can be patchy. And thirdly, we see that different areas score differently depending on the environmental barriers we looked at. So for example, area number 5 is the Fertile Crescent, has smaller temperature barriers compared to the other areas we considered. So that essentially here means small differences in temperature at the location of societies impaired and temperature homogeneity on the path that links them. But when we look at the other barriers, it's not doing that well in terms of topographic barriers. It's doing relatively okay in terms of the size of the ecologically similar neighborhood. So how many other societies are within the very similar temperature and aridity conditions that the Fertile Crescent is experiencing, and is not doing well in terms of aridity barriers. And here are the same plots, but this time for the long-range networks. And I think they pretty much show kind of the same take-home messages. One, Eurasian areas do not consistently show smaller environmental barriers compared to the rest of the world. Second, there's heterogeneity within the same landmass. And third, different areas score differently for different barriers. And I would add a fourth point here, which is that the close and long-range barriers that we computed can show actually different trends. So we see different trends depending on the spatial scale, essentially. So if you remember, the Fertile Crescent had the smaller temperature barriers in the close range networks, but it's scoring here, kind of a mid range for the long spatial scales networks. But conversely, some areas, for example, the South Tropical China and the lower Middle Yangtze River, have small aridity barriers for long and close range networks of neighbors. So they show consistency among spatial scales. So essentially, when looking at it, to wrap this part of the analysis up, when looking at environmental barriers to the spread of culture from the early centers of independent domestication, which again, it is one of the main examples used to support the axis of orientation hypotheses, we don't find a consistent bias in favor of Eurasia. But I know what you're going to say here. You're going to say, but Angela, you're computing all these environmental barriers using climatic data from essentially the present, or it's actually from kind of the last 100 years. But this cultural innovation I'm talking about happened, so for example, the spread of plant and animal domestication happened in the last 12,000 years or so. So for example, if we go back to this figure with agriculture spread from the Fertile Crescent to Europe, these events date back a few millennia. So to test for the robustness of these results in terms of past climatic conditions, we recomputed environmental barriers for comparison between different areas of the globe using maps of temperature and aridity as they were 12, 8, and 4,000 years before present. And we take this climatic data from Kavanaugh et al., who interpolated annual mean temperature and temperature variance, as well as annual mean precipitation and precipitation variability at 1,000 years intervals. And this data dates as far back as 21,000 years before present, but we're not quite interested in that faraway time scale. So these are the same plots that I showed before, but using estimated past climatic values. And I don't want to overwhelm you by showing all the barriers again and all these plots. So I have just plotted here long-range temperature and aridity barriers computed using interpolated climatic data from 12, 8, and 4,000 years ago. Now bear in mind, these barriers don't actually include estimates for the predictability of temperature and precipitation. So they might show differences from our main analysis too, but I think they serve greatly as a robustness check. And looking at these plots, we can see some differences in the relative ranking of these barriers. For example, here, 12,000 years ago, this is Mesoamerica, but then in more recent times, it kind of ranks in terms of temperature turnover in the middle of this group of 4 Eurasian areas. Another example here is North America, towards more in earlier timescales, ranks a bit better in terms of aridity turnover. But the take-home message is the same, is the fact that at none of these time points, Eurasian areas show a consistent advantages over the rest of the world. So to wrap this all up, our results show that although ecological homogeneity can facilitate the spread of cultural innovations, no single continent shows clear ecological advantages over the others. So in the end, did these axes turn the fortunes of history? Well, the jury is out on this one. And I think there is just so much to discuss on this topic. I mean, if you remember from that huge list of ultimate and proximate factors, these analyses only focused on the kind of like top corner. But my hope is that studies such as this one will keep on adding more nuance to both the praises and the criticism of such a huge thesis as the one presented in Guns, Germs, and Steel, and will help us get a deeper understanding on both the very core assumptions of these arguments. So, for example, in terms of this idea whether the environment actually influences cultural spread, but also on the very important consequences and implication of the thesis proposed by Jared Diamond. And with that, I'd like to thank again the Living Earth Collaborative for the invitation to give a talk. And big thanks to Carlos and everybody in the Botero Lab and the WashU family. Also huge thanks to Russell and everyone at the Department of Linguistic and Cultural Evolution in Leipzig. And huge thanks to Kate Kirby for her amazing contribution to both the wonderful DPLACE dataset as well as to this project. And I am happy to answer questions. I'll leave this slide on.
Okay, thank you, Angela, for this very fascinating talk. It is super cool. So while we're waiting for the question to roll in, I have a question of my own. It's kind of a broader questions on because like when you showed the results of your first part, you grouped your cultural traits into different categories, but I think from what I remember, there aren't specific patterns on what cultural traits in these categories are more environmental dependent versus less environmental dependent. Is there like additional, I guess, traits of these cultural traits that kind of links with environment more or less?
Yeah, so I think the way we approached this was essentially it was a data-driven approach to take all the cultural traits in DPLACE and just make decisions of what to include or not necessarily on what we thought was a good or not trait to choose, but on kind of availability of data and what worked well in these models. So it was a purely quantitative approach, and I think the whole point was not to get like not to fall into the same pitfall of selecting certain arguments, but just let the data decide. Well, I do think you're right. Some of these traits are obviously a lot more linked with the environment, whereas for some of them, perhaps the links derive more from just being into the cascading, just being linked to other environmental traits. So for example, if subsistence mode, then further links with, the social pattern of certain societies, it would make both traits be environmentally determined, although the link comes from the dominant mode of subsistence. So I think there's a combination of which ones are truly environmental dependent, which ones get that dependency via correlation with other cultural traits, and then obviously there's the ones which in this case do not show environmental dependence.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your really interesting talk, Dr. Chira. So we have questions starting to stream in. So I'm gonna take one from the audience, and this first one is from Dr. Suzanne Renner, and she's curious about how well the temperature and precipitation capture kind of the environmental barriers for crops and other cultural traits, and sort of if there's any way that you could potentially think about other things like soils or other environmental variables you might have considered.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So this kind of comes back with the criticism that a lot of crops, for example, maybe tolerate a wide range of temperature conditions. So maybe we should look at more specific aspects related to the ecology of plants and animals. For this particular one, we did pick these ones because of relevance, but the availability of data also matters just because these are like huge kind of global scales. But definitely it would be amazing to include, things like soil quality, because we know these are very much linked with the history of some of these traits in different parts of the world. So I think that would be a cool addition to this. And I think that also the kind of highlights one of the ideas of sure, I mean, these are results for temperature and precipitation, but I think when we look maybe at we kind of fall under the spell of saying, wow, these are huge patterns and they don't show necessarily differences, but some environmental traits are more important than others, and they're all equal in our analysis here. So we don't give bigger weights to one or the others, which I think would be a much more realistic, but kind of a complicated maybe to implement at global scales approach.
Thank you. I am reading a question here from Jonathan Myers. Great talk, Angela. Does the age of a culture correlate with its diversity? For example, older cultures may have had more time to accumulate more cultural diversity compared to younger ones.
Yeah, so I think that's an excellent point. And so I think for part one, things kind of like age of settlement would be a cool way to add more depth to this data, because I think definitely it's true that older cultures, I mean, at least in terms of, I don't know if I would say that they have more cultural diversity, but I would say in terms of sharing, in terms of the odds of pairs sharing a cultural trait, I think the longer they have maybe been in contact, there's a higher chance of them sharing that. I think to some extent we do get at that by adding the phylogenetic distance between using the phylogeny of languages.
Really interesting. So you have a lot of questions coming in. So this next one is from James Stroud, and he is curious, sort of as human technology has evolved through time, do you see that the strength of different environmental barriers change? So for instance, his idea here is that, aridity as a barrier could perhaps relax with the invention of better sort of modes of travel or water storage. So he's curious about whether you see those sorts of covariances.
Yeah, I think that is a really good point. And this is not something that we incorporate in the in part one, because we just use the kind of current environmental conditions, just because we don't have a good, so when we're looking at cultural similarity in the pair, we don't have a good idea when each of them got a certain cultural trait. And so kind of to be able to say, well, does this barrier between them, relaxes with the implementation of different cultural, of different other innovations. But I think it would be hard to do that for this kind of global scale. But I think it would be possible, maybe kind of on a smaller subset of cultures for which we have a very good cultural data on, technological innovations, and then also on exactly when they got the traits they do. The ones we use here, the cultural traits are usually scored around like 1800s or 1900s. So they're kind of like the tip of the phylogeny, the cultural traits as they are today, rather than at, exactly knowing when they got it and how it evolved.
Interesting. So now I have a question on, I guess, from Suzanne Renner from the top on please let me know if I'm not interpreting this question correctly. So in your models, you quantify environmental barriers like precipitations and temperature, but not on cultural resistance. So things like mirroring patterns, these things could also contribute to, I guess, resistance to cultural transmission. Can you comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, so that's a really good point, and I think there might be, well, I mean, maybe environmental factors are not important, but I think that is what I was hinting at when I said that maybe, for example, with the major crop type, the cultural factors could be they're an important aspect of whether or not like you see cultural similarities. So essentially, whether or not a society adopts a certain cultural trait from their neighbors, because I think there's a lot of cultural factors why that would not every time societies adopt something that is let's say the best thing that they can use in that particular environment. I can't think on top of my head on a particular example, but the one that comes to mind is kind of a Vikings going to Greenland and Iceland, and for a while still adhering to their cultural traits, and for example the use of cattle, whereas I mean sheep and also was a lot better livestock to have than cattle in those environments. And also the Inuits had, again, very like they relied on fishing and hunting, and those were the appropriate ones to take, whereas the Vikings kind of the Norse hold to their cultural traditions. So in this idea of cultural resistance, so I think that could come into play. Again, it's just something that it's hard to put in quantitatively, but I definitely think it's an important point.
Thanks. So Brett Seymour has a question, and he is curious about how connected the arid areas are through sort of riparian habitats and the potential for sort of corridors through, some of these deserts that are kind of that are driven by these riparian areas, and what role that might be playing in connectivity across sort of environmental barriers.
Yeah, I think that is a really good point, and definitely these corridors exist, and across deserts, and I mean, we know things like the Silk Road, just in terms of more generally speaking about the corridors that humans take. Mountain passes are really important. For example, I don't know, like maybe 3-4 millennia before Common Era, there was a huge trade, and societies in kind of the Fertile Crescent area were just trading all these like lapis lazuli and all these minerals from all around. They went up to the Hindus Kush, and these corridors were not kind of necessarily the paths that maybe our estimates just by using aridity and temperature would get. They were there were a lot of these paths that definitely we couldn't incorporate, and maybe not even the scale of our cells when we calculate things accounted for that. So I think, again, kind of hard to implement as a quantitative stage, but something at the global stage, but definitely something that could work really well for more smaller spatial scales, because I do believe that particularly in terms of mountain passes and very arid regions, there were routes and corridors that perhaps are not encapsulated by our least cost path.
Cool. So I have a question from me again. So kind of similar to when we think about traits in other animal systems or plant systems, there are kind of like a hierarchical relationship of how like one trait may be derived from the other. So I'm thinking of whether like some of the cultural traits could be derived from some existing cultural traits, and then how can we go about like disentangling why these two traits coexist? Is it because of the common environmental factors that give rise to both of these, or is it like one emerged at the first place and then that makes it easier for the second cultural trait to derive?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case for some of these traits, and there's these, the kind of links between these factors obviously like depend a lot on when we look at, but there is this kind of a very broad link between kind of having basing your subsistence on agriculture and having settlement society that kind of then links into this evolution of or whatever change into having property laws, because once you're settled you actually have land, so then you have the laws of property that kind of cascade into the stratified societies, etc. So I think for some cultural traits these links are there's like research on it, but I haven't actually implemented that in these analyses. So I think for example, when we look across our 67 traits and we see, I don't know how many times these models show environmental dependency, I definitely think some of those cases could be, like you say, just a cascading effect. And I think it'll be cool. I mean, it's definitely possible to, I don't know how exactly to look at it in this particular framework, but the dependency of them, yeah, we could totally look into that.
Awesome. Well, I think we have time for just one more question, and I'm going to ask it because I'm interested. So do you have plans to test any of the other ideas from the book or from any of Jared Diamond's other books? And it's okay if you don't want to like give away anything cool you've got going on, but I'm curious to hear sort of what your next plans are.
Yeah, so I don't have anything actually in the works, but I think definitely there's a lot there to be tested, and I'm a big fan of bringing these kind of a quantitative tests for this kind of popular science book and the hypothesis that he puts forward. I personally am a fan. I mean, I loved Guns, Germs, and Steel when I read it. I read it before being a scholar, if I can say so, in cultural evolution. It made a huge impact on me, and I loved it, and I told everybody about it. So and there's a lot in there to unpack. So I don't have anything in the works, but I definitely think he provides with a wealth of testable hypotheses. And whether or not these are going to actually prove to be supported by this test, I mean, that's a different question, but I think it would be exciting to do something like that. But I don't have anything in the works, I'm sorry.
All right, that wraps up our seminar on Dr. Chira. Thank you again for such a wonderful seminar on. We all learned a lot, and everyone else, we will see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.